Graphic Medicine Podcast. I'm your host, MK Serwick. With Ian Williams, I co-run graphicmedicine.org, a website that explores the vast intersection of comics and health. On today's show, Jordana Greenblatt in her presentation about HIV/AIDS memoir comics from the Comics and Medicine Conference in Riverside, California last year, and an interview with Sarah Leavitt, creator of the graphic memoir Tangles, about what she's reading. But before we begin the show, I want to tell you that support for this podcast comes from the Penn State College of Medicine, Department of Humanities, the nation's oldest humanities department within a medical school, pioneers of innovation in medical education since 1967. To learn more about Penn State College of Medicine, Department of Humanities, go to www.med.psu.edu/humanities. In my first segment, Graphic Medicine News, things are progressing well for the upcoming Comics and Medicine Conference this summer in Dundee, Scotland. Hopefully you'll be joining us there. We're currently reviewing abstracts that have been submitted and hope to have a program together soon. In addition, hotel rooms are now bookable. Go to the Graphic Medicine website to find out more. For the latest publications, news stories, and event updates in Graphic Medicine, be sure to like our Facebook page. In the last few weeks, we've posted links to a review from India of Ian Williams' book, The Bad Doctor, a short movie about the New Yorker cartoonist and physician Benjamin Schwartz, who was previously featured on this podcast, and a recently discovered webcomic called Cancer Owl. So be sure to check all that out on the Graphic Medicine Facebook page. In my second segment today, Jordana Greenblatt. Jordana Greenblatt teaches in the English department at York University in Toronto, Canada. Her research interests include queer theory, sexuality, comics, and contemporary literature and culture. I hope you'll enjoy her presentation from the 2015 Riverside Conference, and I've dropped images into the feed, so keep an eye on your screens.
Our third presenter is Jordana Greenblatt. The title of the talk is Jordana Greenblatt's talk is Internal and External Spaces of Threat and Dissolution, HIV/AIDS Graphic Memoir.
Given their ability to visualize bodies in states of dissolution and to mobilize resonances between image and text, to express what words alone can't quite capture, comics seem particularly amenable to expressing the effect of HIV/AIDS, as theorized by William Haver, of troubling inside-outside bodily boundaries, pushing us towards the edge of the erotically thinkable. Yet HIV/AIDS graphic memoirs are not common, and the two most prominent examples reflect subject positions external to and externalizing of HIV. Written from the perspective of straight male loved ones, Judd Winnick's Pedro and Me and Frederick Peters' Blue Pills express the, quote, desire for discursive ordering and, quote, the temptations of a discourse of redemption, flashed by Sarah Brophy as the particular risk of second-hand accounts in witnessing AIDS. Locating HIV's challenge to bodily containment outside of the self, they externalize both threat and new knowledge, filtering them through liberal discourses of compassion and personal growth, and what Brophy terms, quote, a more liberal and tolerant version of closure, partaking of the conservative position's fetishization of life by replicating an uncritical investment in the nuclear family's procreative potential. David Wojnarowicz's 7 Miles a Second is a first-person account that resists redemptive visions of procreative, compassionate closure, regularly troubling divisions between internal spaces of the body and external spaces of the outside world. Rather than turning to discourses of compassion and the recuperative heterosexual family, discourses that often reaffirm boundaries between the inside space of the compassionate body and disease, 7 Miles a Second expresses feelings of personal and social dissolution that trouble inside and outside as distinct spaces. In its pages, human bodies, machines, and giant creatures merge, blend, and open themselves to their surroundings. While Winnick and Peters rethink the self in relation to external threats, ultimately reframed through experiences of love and compassion, Wojnarowicz's memoir captures bodily boundary breakdowns, enacting the challenges to the thinkable self that Haver frames as HIV's most philosophically compelling attribute. Compassion and redemption seem like positive affects, particularly given the stigmatization of HIV-positive people and people with AIDS. Yet, as Lauren Berlant notes in Compassion, quote, in operation, compassion is a term denoting privilege. The sufferer is over there. You, the compassionate one, have a resource that would alleviate someone else's suffering, a dynamic very evident in Winnick's memoir. Employing a personal growth narrative, Winnick rejects his earlier stereotyped perspective of HIV, presenting himself as having seen HIV people as giant walking viruses, although I always find it particularly weird that the virus looks like a potato. I mean, people knew at this point, like, had an idea of what a virus looks like. It's not a potato. But anyway, or shrouded figures, distinctly external to himself. While Winnick criticizes his earlier perspective, commenting that, quote, the bleeding heart liberal was walking around with a bag full of stereotypes, his integration of Pedro, his roommate on MTV's The Real World 3 and a prominent AIDS educator, into his closer affective proximity relies on reframing Pedro as a more appropriate object of intimate affect associated with domestic and domesticated space. Compassion is not a fixed, equitable response. As Berlant notes, quote, when we are taught from the time we are taught anything to measure the scale of pain and attachment, to feel appropriately compassionate, we are being trained in stinginess, not caring. The propriety of compassion and its object is particularly pointed when it comes to AIDS, and particularly implicated in idyllic visions of procreative families and innocent children. The child frequently figures as compassion's most proper object, a rationale for stinginess whose hypocrisy Wojnarowicz points out in describing a homophobic politician on TV. It is ironic, he writes, when he takes on the face of a family man who wants to protect his children, because I am his child and I have AIDS, and AIDS is used as a weapon to enforce the conservative agenda. Wojnarowicz both mobilizes and resists the centrality to compassionate thrift of the child and its association with domestic intimacy. The reframing of queer AIDS casualty as innocent child legitimizes compassion's propriety. Narrating Pedro's childhood, Winnick represents him as saintly in spite of his impoverished beginning. Categorized by a sage of Santeria in his native Cuba as, quote, a grande cabeza, a wise one, he was born to save lives, Pedro was thus vulnerable to being spirited away by angels. The saintly child Pedro, appearing only a few pages after Winnick's depiction of shrouded PWAs and walking potato viruses, replaces the image of dehumanized and external adult sufferers with a supernaturally innocent and wise child, his ultimate death reframed by the image of angel wings that threaten to carry him away because his future has so much to offer. Compare then this image to our introduction to Wojnarowicz as a child hustler at the beginning of his memoir. Standing in front of a garish storefront, David is not cute, and his assertion, my little legs hurt, ironically contrasts sentimentalizations of childhood with his both literal and figurative position as a sex worker avoiding the vice squad. Even in childhood, Wojnarowicz exists distinctly outside of the comfortable domestic space used to legitimize compassion. While Winnick redeems Pedro's adolescent promiscuity by relating it to the loss of his beloved mother, representing him as, quote, young, lonely, confused, and needing love, by the time Wojnarowicz as child hustler becomes a homeless teen, quote, I couldn't even hustle anymore. You could see my entire skeleton, piece by piece, move beneath my skin. Wojnarowicz's representation of his childhood and adolescence refuses to countenance the recuperative images of childhood used to draw adult PWAs back into the spaces where compassion's proper objects must reside. Pedro's compassionate recuperation as innocent child is, on the other hand, incorporated into the nuclear family space as Winnick begins to perceive him as a sick person. Describing how, quote, I would wake up and watch him breathe, I was afraid he would stop, Pedro was like my little brother, it was my job to look out for him. Winnick claims Pedro as a brother, but waking to watch him breathe resonates on a parental register, repurposing their shared room as a nursery. A more literal sick child in bed, mobilizes Peter's recuperations in blue pills as he steps into a paternal role, complete with paternalistic lessons to give. As Peter watches his HIV-positive girlfriend, Katty, and her HIV-positive son as the child awaits minor surgery at the hospital, Peters muses, quote, "For me, too, it feels strange to see him in a hospital bed. I can't stop myself from thinking that he's inextricably tied to the medical world, that he's lived and that he will live until the end in latent sickness." Peters redeems this moment by taking the opportunity to explain to the wide-eyed child why the elephants are scared of mice in Dumbo. Asserting, quote, "I love his elementary little questions. They allow me to give long answers spiked with cheap morality." Introducing his narrative of their growing bond against an image of the child in a crib, sucking a bottle, he states, quote, "I think that in the end I let myself be guided by him. I let him play with the tiller, and in fact our relationship evolves according to circumstances and his own initiative. Evolves to ultimately position Peters as, quote, the alpha male of the pack." Lee Edelman argues that the figure of the child enables a fantasy of futurity, meaning and progress. Futurity dependent upon, quote, the reproductive, capital C, couple charged with the responsibility of bearing it, who stand in opposition to what Edelman terms sans-homosexuels, associated with death and often queerness, quote, whose loss is perceived as none at all since they represent loss itself, represent more precisely loss of self, of coherence, of life, and of heirs. Peter's memoir, while more self-critical than Winnick's, replicates its reproductive, heteronormative futurity and reliance on the domestic and domesticated spaces as validations of compassion. While Peter's engagement is more intimate, given his own risk of contracting HIV in his relationship, he still coaches HIV as an external threat to bodily coherence. Depicting his infection anxiety as a looming rhinoceros separating him and Katty, Peters ultimately expresses his personal growth in an imagined conversation with a mammoth. Here, he does question some of the premises that motivate the compassion narrative, stating explicitly, quote, "I am less and less tolerant of compassion," and wondering, quote, "Sometimes I wonder if I feel good in this story because I have the easy role in it. I'm not the one who has HIV." Yet, the conversation takes place as Peters grows beardier and scruffier, seeming to regress to an earlier, more primal image of capital M man. Indeed, Peters has already informed us that, quote, "Katty's surprised and cautious attitude put me in a situation of incontestable domination. She offered me, rather she forced on me, the role of omnipotent male." His more evocative images of the relationship between HIV and the self circulate around how, quote, "Katty sometimes also confused herself with the virus, a confusion that manifests as barbed wire surrounding Katty, a boundary that Peters, in the quintessential gendered fairy tale mode, must penetrate and overcome." Even Peters' more contemplative conversation with the mammoth defers to the hetero-reproductive family and its space. As he is finally attacked by a pterodactyl, which is replaced by Katty's son's face, we soon see that the mammoth, the man, the pterodactyl, and death are all toys in an innocent child's game, taking place on the floor of the family home as the child's future drives the recuperative meaning of Peter's life. 7 miles a second allows for no such recuperation. Haber notes that the notion of clean and proper bodies accords with, quote, "clean and proper bodies politics," and that the normative approach defends against AIDS by a, quote, "prophylaxis conceived in terms of containment, by regarding the body as nothing but its instrumentality. In other words, the erotic is conceived to be a simple transaction between an unproblematic self and a disgusting but essentially unproblematic other, between ontologically primordial entities." While Peter's narrative reclaims bodily penetrability back into discourses of heterosexual conquest, his moment of deepest contemplation overtly visualizing the primordial, and Winnick's into the smooth figure of the idealized and unthreatening child, 7 miles a second juxtaposes Wojnarowicz's meditation on, quote, the thin line between inside and outside, against an image of him as a giant smashing buildings, far from the non-threatening innocent and the domestic space with which it is associated. And while Peters offers Winnick reassurance about the security of his bodily boundaries by explaining the virtual impossibility of contracting HIV via kissing, since, quote, people don't generally kiss anyone bleeding out of the mouth, Wojnarowicz represents even his childhood self as already exactly that for us. Narrating the trick with which he begins his memoir, Wojnarowicz writes, quote, because I was so lacking in those vitamins found in Wonder Bread, my gums would bleed every time I smoked a cigarette, as he probes at his bleeding gums against the drone of his John's paternal prattle about his own adult children. Far from embracing a recuperative idea of a compassionate, more innocent future, Wojnarowicz's claim that, quote, I am consumed by the emptiness lying beneath each and every action I witness of others and myself, each little action continuing the slow death of ourselves, the slow motion approach of the unveiling of our order and disorder in its ultimate climax, beginning with a spark so subtle and beautiful that to trust it is to trust our own stupidity, appears beneath James Romberger's image of a train merging the organic and mechanical, shedding money, guts, and blood. Rather than drive towards a future redeemed by the child's uncontaminated wisdom and domesticity, Wojnarowicz's future is defined by penetrability, death, and subjective dissolution. In short, it is no future at all. The human subject, normative or not, is never affirmed in terms of either its bodily integrity, its subjective coherence, or its reproductive futurity. Indeed, the body as affective and erotic locus exceeds linear historicization or narrativization. Wojnarowicz writes, quote, when I put my hands on your body, on your flesh, I feel the history of that body, not just the beginning of its forming in that distant lake, but all the way beyond its ending. Wojnarowicz's temporality expands and contracts fluidly beyond a future that, like Edelman's santhomosexual, was that the big?
You're at 15 minutes. Yeah.
Okay, I'm almost done. Wojnarowicz's temporality expands and contracts fluidly beyond a future that, like Edelman's santhomosexual, produces no air, resisting bodily and subjective integrity to grasp instead a fundamentally erotic and unboundable present characterized by leakage between spaces, subjects, and categories. Wojnarowicz's text, which surrounds the central image of bodies disintegrating, merging, and exploding in the act of sex, and a patchwork of discordant images of death, floral growth, and travel, which is, quote, if I could attach our blood vessels so we could become each other, I would. If I could attach our blood vessels in order to anchor you to the earth, to this present time, I would. If I could open up your body and slip up inside your skin and look out your eyes and forever have my lips fused with yours, I would. Rather than validate the HIV-positive objective compassion through a hermetic figure of childhood innocence or boundaries penetrated only by heterosexual conquest, 7 miles a second affirms an erotic of subjective dissolution and bodily intercontamination in the present. As Haver argues in the erotic, quote, we are dealing with surfaces that are neither inside nor outside, sites at which the putative corporeal integrity of the so-called self is always already ambiguous, sites that are always already wounds and therefore susceptible to infection by the other, indeed by otherness itself. In Wojnarowicz's version of erotic care, rather than subjectivity consolidating compassion that functions through stinginess and externalization, blood, guts, and bone commune to diminish the boundaries between self and other, an interpenetration that inherently produces no air. Far from the affirmations of appropriate compassion justified by the figure of the wise yet innocent child and the monolithic sexual identity that Edelman associates with its responsible, subjectively coherent progenitors, 7 miles a second is a project of care, not compassion. Rather than strive to reassert heterosexuality's subjectively coherent possession of the resource that would alleviate the suffering of another outside the self, 7 miles a second posits care as a project of denying the very distinctions upon which liberal compassion and the liberal subject rely. Thank you.
A very thought-provoking and interesting talk, particularly to me because I have just finished creating an AIDS memoir from a very different perspective than the 3 books Jordana discusses in that talk. There's a lot to think about there. For our next segment, What Are You Reading? I caught up with Jordana's fellow Canadian Sarah Leavitt, creator of the amazing work Tangles, a story about Alzheimer's, my mother, and me. Hey, Sarah Leavitt, welcome to the Graphic Medicine Podcast.
Thank you, MK.
So this is my segment called What Are You Reading? And I've noticed on social media that you'd been posting about something you're reading. So since I had just finished it, I wanted the opportunity to talk about it. Tell me, what are you reading?
Well, I am reading, I guess I'm rereading now, but Tom Hart's Rosalie Lightning, a graphic memoir, which is, for people who don't know, it's a book about his experience and his wife's experience of losing their 2-year-old daughter, Rosalie Lightning. She's almost 2 when she dies. It kind of punched me in the face repeatedly, I think I would say about it. And I'm just still kind of dipping back into different parts of it to see, just kind of trying to figure out what all the reasons are that I loved it so much.
So tell me more about, so describe it some more. Just tell me about the art and kind of just aspects of it that gripped you.
The art is so amazing. And I want to read a lot more about how Tom Hart did this book. But, so there's things that I don't know yet exactly. Because I know a lot of it is, you know how people use the little tone stuff that's like Letraset, you like rub it on. And I don't know if that's actually what he used here or if he did it like in Photoshop, but there's these areas of pattern and tone, and the way he uses them, they look like little scraps of paper that have been cut up and put onto the page. So that's one of the aspects of the art that I actually like best. The thing about the art that I like best is all the ways in which it contributes to this overwhelming sense of grief and loss and darkness and struggle. And one of the ways is by using little cut up pieces of this stuff that I know I should know the name of, but it's not in my head right now because I'm in my 40s. But at least I hope that's why. So he cuts that up and it looks like little scraps of paper, and it kind of adds to this feeling that he and his wife are really shattered and scattered apart by the death of Rosalie. And then one of the other things among the many that I really like is a lot of the pages are almost all black, and you're kind of getting glimpses of their process, their lives, glimpses of the present and of the past, from little windows, kind of circular windows in the black page. So you'll catch these little glimpses of their lives. And one of the things that I love most about Tom Hart's art in this book is that his characters really don't look the same at all times. But you always know that it's him and his wife, but they look different in different places. His drawing style gets scruffier in some places and more precise in others. Sometimes they're just these little shapes that have been mostly erased or covered over with darkness. There's like dark marks on his face that don't totally correspond to shadows or shading. It's more symbolic of his state of mind. It's like he doesn't really care, kind of in a good way, because I just picture him at his drawing table just hammering out these intense drawings of this is what it looks like, that it's not pretty and it's not polished, and this is what I looked like then. There's this beautiful, beautiful drawing where he and his wife are looking out of a window, and most of their features aren't even there. And I just feel like he doesn't care in this way that's really excellent and that completely serves his work, and that I'm glad he didn't care. Well, maybe he did care, but it seems like he didn't, because he just had to get this stuff out. On the other hand, I don't want to make it sound like he just barfed this book out on the page, because obviously he didn't. He took great care in structuring it and framing it. So I guess it's a balance, and I'm thinking about the class I'm teaching right now and students and how we are actually just earlier today talking about the balance between getting this intense story out on the page, but also putting all your skills into making really conscious choices and creating a careful structure. The book starts with his daughter, and well, it starts, the very beginning of it is just these solid black pages, and then this one page is all black, and then there's this small little opening in the middle of it through which you can glimpse some leaves and branches, and then it gets bigger and you see more of the trees and branches, and then he starts off by saying, her favorite image, in a single night, the oak tree grows to full height from a scattering of acorns in the garden. And he starts talking about her favorite video that she liked to watch, Totoro, and just kind of, you start right with Rosalie and her way of looking at the world. And the other thing I want to talk about is how he draws Rosalie Lightning. He draws her as this exaggerated little cartoon character, this little girl who's so full of energy and joy, and she's really, really cute and dear, but there's like nothing cutesy about her. To me, she looks like this very sturdy, brave, joyful kid who, the way that he's used comic exaggeration of, she has this great big mouth and great big nose, and the way he uses that technique of exaggeration of her features and her body language to really convey the kind of joy that a 2-year-old has and that a 2-year-old expresses without any kind of filter. Mm-hmm. Do you know what I mean? So like on one of the first pages, he shows these images from Totoro, and then he shows her watching the television, and her arms are just way up in the air because she's watching the oak trees grow. So yeah, just the way he draws her is incredible and also heartbreaking. I just wanted to talk about this. Can I talk about a couple specific pages?
Sure. Yeah, sure.
So for those of you following along at home, there's like this page, page 21, where he's talking about how he and Leela spend a lot of time just lying on the ground because they can't walk. They're so heartbroken. And so he shows this view of what you see when you're lying on the ground in the grass. The background and foreground and midground are all equally in focus. You can only focus on one aspect at a time. So either the background, the middle ground, or the foreground. And then he has this series of 3 panels where he says past, present, or future. And the past is Rosalie bending down to pick up acorns. The present is him lying on the ground. And the future is just blackness with these kind of unrecognizable shapes in it. So that is just an incredible example of what you can do in comics to convey grief. You start with this very detailed image of what he's seeing when he's lying on the ground, and then he just breaks it down into a series of 3 drawings where he first shows the background in detail and nothing else, then the midground in detail and nothing else, and then the foreground in detail and nothing else, and then goes on to compare it to the past, present, and future. And I just thought that was incredible. And my other favorite page is 111, where he and his wife are again walking around just heartbroken, and they often have little kinds of gray clouds all around them as well. And the first panel on this page shows them walking along the sidewalk, and it says, our joyful memories are now sorrowful, painful. And then the next panel shows them still walking and starting to turn back, and it says, Leela thinks Orpheus is like this when you look backwards. And then the next panel is like this incredible drawing of Rosalie Lightning with her little fist clenched and this huge grin and her eyes all squinched up, and she looks like she's in the middle of like this incredibly fun game. And so in the panel before that, it says, Leela thinks Orpheus is like this when you look backwards. And then in that panel of the beautiful drawing of Rosalie, the text says, you are torn apart. And I don't know, it's just like, oh my God, that's comics, right? Where you can have this crazy cartoonish drawing of a little girl, and and the text, you are torn apart, and it's just, yeah. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it's amazing. I mean, I'm really glad to hear you talking about this piece in so much detail, because I feel like it requires it. It's there's such a complex experience of that grieving that is so evident in this book. And I think, when I read it, I was so overwhelmed by it. I finished it, but I put it down like I had to, absorb it. And what's interesting is that despite the fact that it's about losing a child and that grief, and it's rendered so intensely, there's nothing maudlin about it at all. It's so beautiful, but also painful.
And that's, I was kind of thinking about, because I knew we were going to talk, and I was thinking about all the things I really love about this book. And one of the things I love about it is that it's not just, I think why it doesn't read as maudlin is it's kind of about just putting one foot in front of the other. And that's what I appreciated most about it. Something he keeps coming back to, is how they walk around the neighborhood just kind of blindly after she dies. And, well, not blindly, I mean, noticing everything that breaks their heart. But that it's not this story of suffering and then redemption. It's more about just finding your way through the blackness, and eventually you come to a place that's slightly less black, and you will have joy in your life again, and you will always have experienced this horrific loss. And to me, as somebody who's lost, I lost my mom, and it was incredibly painful, and that's the kind of book I want to read. You lived through this experience that was awful and that scarred you forever, and here you are creating beautiful art and surviving and moving through the world. And the other thing, this is a little bit of a veering off, but the other thing that I just loved about this book was the love between him and Leela, and how they were going through this together. And so much of that was unspoken. So much of it was just them, their two figures glued together, their two figures with the same expression on their face, and just, surviving together. And that's a big deal. That's not what every couple does after they lose a child or after they experience something traumatic together.
Right.
There's just as big a chance, right, that you're gonna split apart, or that particularly the guy is gonna not be able to deal with expressing emotions, and the woman's gonna be alone in that if it's a straight couple. So, I just want that to be really remarked upon, that this is a book about grief and loss and survival, and it's also a book about loving your partner, and it's a book about being an emotional man, and it's also a book about accepting help from friends, right? That's a big one, is their friends are a huge part of this book.
Yeah, they are. They're sort of like the architecture it's built on.
And which ends up also being about them being part of a cartoonist and artist community. But don't you agree that that's not really a typical loss narrative, to bring in the friends and the community? Absolutely,
yeah.
In a way, that's more of a kind of a queer angle on it, because queer stories often talk about chosen family and community. Yeah, but there's this other page that I just love. Page 125 is about him and Leela waking up in the morning, and they just peer out of this window, and they're so tiny, and their faces are almost obliterated by gray lines and gray shading. And that's just one example of how he shows them being together in this.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. Is there any other thoughts on the book that you wanted to share?
No, just that I think all of those are examples of how, I think, well, you and I have talked before in other settings about what is it about comics that is so, lends itself to stories like these. And I think just what we were talking about with the drawing technique and exaggeration, and the way he uses light and dark, and the way he erases part of his characters, or, the different techniques that he uses, those are really key to this story. And this story could only exist in this form, in this way.
Right. There's things that you can do in this medium that you can't do in text alone or image alone, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I was just thinking about the ways in which there is something about comics that are particularly, based on, just how much the community of graphic medicine has grown, something about comics that are particularly well suited to tell these kinds of stories. I was just looking at a list this morning of someone had created an online list of nonfiction comics. And so it was just this long list, and they were divided into categories like reportage and, different categories. And in the memoir category of nonfiction comics, every single one of the examples had to do with basically graphic medicine. They were all graphic medicine titles. And I thought, well, that's very interesting. There are so many other topics you could do a memoir comic about, but all the titles in this whole article was not graphic medicine oriented. But isn't that interesting? All the memoir titles had to do with health and illness and loss and grief.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. And those would be, like, all my books are about trauma.
Right. When I was teaching, which is, I think you teach to general undergraduate students, right?
Uh-huh.
And I remember when I was teaching that, I'm like, I really worked hard to find a book to balance out, like, that was just, I think I ended up choosing one of Lucy Nisley's food books because I was like, I gotta balance this out.
Yeah, I know. They're just going to be like, either they're going to think you have a problem, or they're just going to be like, forget these autobiographical comics.
They're too depressing. Yeah.
Well, and sometimes I find, like, there are for sure lots of diary comics that are just about kind of the ins and outs of daily life, and honestly, like, those barely ever appeal to me.
Right, they're just not as compelling, right.
Like, my life is certainly not compelling day to day.
Right.
The things that are compelling are the bigger things, or, maybe events that aren't gigantic, but things that you can somehow draw deeper meaning from. And I guess those are often things that are really difficult.
Yeah. So speaking of your day-to-day life, I wanted to catch up on, I know our fans would be interested, so what are you working on these days, post-Tangles?
Post-Tangles. Well, I'm working on a few things. A couple are actually related to Tangles. One is that I'm working on a project that's going to be online and interactive that goes into some of the backstory behind Tangles. So looking at some of the materials that I used to when I was working on the book, like and photographs and notes and letters. It's going to be set up in a way where you kind of move through different things that happen in the book, but you get an insight into the book. Like, you can, there will be an interview with my aunt, or, some photos of my mom from her childhood, or things like that. So it's almost like a companion piece to Tangles in a way.
Oh, that's so cool. And when is that going to be?
So, good question. When is it going to exist? I don't know. We've been working on it for a few years. We're working on it with the National Film Board of Canada, and right now, we're just finishing up development, and we're really hoping to get greenlit for production by the summer. So that is working with interactive designers and animators, and just a great team of people.
Very cool.
And then I'm also working with, one of the parties that is working on the interactive piece is Giant Ant Media, and they're a production company in Vancouver. Well, I guess not a production company. They're an animation studio, but they do a lot more. They do lots of web-based interactive animated work, some commercial, and then like shorter pieces. And so they optioned the rights to Tangles a few years ago to do a feature-length film. And so they've created a trailer that you can access via my website, sarahleavitt.com. That's like a 2-minute animated trailer. And right now, we are involved in some exciting discussions about getting the project funded. So I'm hoping that we will have good news about that soon. But, I've kind of been involved in a few different conversations about Tangles as a film, and, sometimes you think something's going to happen and then maybe it doesn't.
Yeah.
So I'm trying not to get too excited, but I'm hoping that something good is going to happen.
Well, I'm right there with you. I've seen the trailer, and it's just so exciting to imagine the entire book in that form. So it's hard I can't imagine what it's like for you, because it's hard for me to restrain myself from getting so excited about it.
I actually sold the rights to the film like a number of years ago to somebody else who was this amazing woman, director and producer, who really wanted to do something with the book. And then I was so excited about that and so convinced that it was going to happen like tomorrow.
Yeah.
And then it just never happened. Not because she did anything wrong, but just she changed her mind. So I'm just trying to not get too excited.
Yeah, I hear you.
And then my third thing, but which is consuming most of my time right now when I'm not at my day job to support myself, is my next book, which is completely different from Tangles. It's historical fiction, and it is about a serial killer. So just to share that MK and Nita Mahato and I all kind of, we have our little process group. So a creative blog. No, I think we've all talked about it. Process group where we're encouraging each other and keeping each other going, which I've just, the more I do that with you guys, and we each have our weekly deadlines, the more I'm convinced that without it, I would not be doing anything except lying on the floor and crying about not doing art.
Well, let me take a second to just describe that. So what it is, and I do this because I highly recommend it to anyone working on a creative project, is that we are three people who met through Comics and Medicine, who all three have specific projects that we're working on, and we use the blog as a weekly check-in point to post your progress. And then get feedback and ask questions, but it's not even necessarily, although the feedback is wonderful, it's about just having the deadline and knowing that there are people out there who are going to look every week and see what are you doing, and even if it's like I took a pencil and I sharpened it this week, that's something, right?
That might be my next post.
But through the entire process. And this has been going on for a couple years now. We worked through Ivan Brunetti's entire book, which is how this started. Cartooning, that's right, Cartooning Philosophy and Practice, which also, if you're a new cartoonist, I highly recommend. That book really kind of helped us all solidify how we wanted to move forward in this world, the world of comics. So you'd already done your book, but it was really helpful for me, certainly. But anyway, that's how the blog started, and I highly recommend it. Find a few people who you can trust to be there for you, and it's just been fantastic for me as well.
Yeah, it's true, hey? We just have, I don't know, there's this way in which, each of us works in a very different style and different kinds of content, but there's a way in which we're able to give each other support and feedback and just encouragement that is just invaluable.
Yeah.
And I'm working with my students, that's been a huge thing for them as well. I work with creative writing students who, my class is like an introduction to making comics, and most of them have never done comics before, and a huge portion of them fall in love with comics. Now, some of them never do comics again, and others of them actually go on to work on comics, and some of their ability to do that is because they form connections with other students in the class. So they're able to keep supporting each other to do that work. Because, they're very dismayed by how much work is involved in comics.
Yeah, and the amount of time it takes.
Dismayed by that.
Yeah. Yeah, just the amount of time it takes, and And you do need to have, and also because it's such isolating solo work, especially on a long-term project, you really do need these ways to connect with others who are going through it as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me today. I really appreciate it, and I hope everyone enjoys this interview. I know they will.
Thank you.
That's it for this episode of the Graphic Medicine Podcast. As always, thanks for listening. And it's my pleasure to remind you that support for this podcast comes from Penn State College of Medicine, Department of Humanities, the nation's oldest humanities department within a medical school, pioneers of innovations in medical education since 1967. Thanks for listening, and have a great week.